Han Solo. I'm captain of the Millennium Falcon. Chewie here tells me you're looking for passage to the Alderaan system.
Yes, indeed. If it's a fast ship.
Fast ship? You've never heard of the Millennium Falcon?
Should I have?
It's the ship that made the Kessel run in less than 12 parsecs. I've outrun Imperial starships. Not the local bulk cruisers, mind you. I'm talking about the big Corellian ships now. She's fast enough for you, old man. What's the cargo?
Only passengers. Myself, the boy, 2 droids, and no questions asked.
What is it, some kind of local trouble?
Let's just say we'd like to avoid any Imperial entanglements.
Welcome, Masters and Padawans, to episode 83 of Full of Sith. I am the Mike Pilot. With me, my co-host, Brian Young, Bobby Roberts. Special guest co-host tonight, Chris Taylor from Mashable, from the book How Star Wars Conquered the Universe. Welcome, Chris. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's so good to be back. I'm really excited to be on the show again. And to be a guest co-host. I mean, that's so cool. I'm putting that in my resume.
Yeah, that needs to go right on your online bio. But yeah, we had so much fun with you last time, and we're going to talk about some things. Brian, what are those things?
So, Chris, for his book, How Star Wars Conquered the Universe, talked to everyone. He talked to everyone, spare no one as far as the story of Star Wars. And one of those people he talked to was Gary Kurtz. And Gary Kurtz is a very interesting figure in Star Wars, and we're going to be talking about him because Chris interviewed him and brought some audio bits from that interview he did for the book that we'll listen to and we'll talk about. But Kurtz is definitely interesting because depending on who you talk to, he got involved in Star Wars in a different way, and he got not involved in Star Wars in a different way.
Yeah, the figure of Gary Kurtz is very interesting within the fandom, and you'd know this if you've been part of the fandom for longer than even like 6 months. Gary Kurtz has sort of been built into a singular figure when it comes to Star Wars, and Gary Kurtz is a large part of how fans come to mythologize not just Star Wars, which is a mythology in and of itself, but the making of Star Wars. And what's happened over time is that the name Gary Kurtz and the name George Lucas don't even really come to represent the people who helped make those first 2 Star Wars movies, but they end up getting turned into sort of like professional wrestling characters that fans will like to bang against each other like those old rubber WWF toys that we used to have in the 80s. And it's just sort of like, well, Star Wars is good because George Lucas did this thing. And someone else is like, no, Star Wars is good because Gary Kurtz told George Lucas to go pound sand, and then they smash each other to death. And so many people have so many opinions as to why Star Wars is good and who you ascribe that to, and then a mythology gets built out of that. And Mr. Taylor here cut through a ton of that, decades of that sort of strange, not very helpful mythologizing of how Star Wars was made by talking directly to Gary Kurtz. And Chris, how did that go? What happened?
It went pretty well. I mean, Gary is kind of an elusive figure. We all know he was the producer on the original Star Wars and the producer of The Empire Strikes Back. And then he left in circumstances that are still disputed to this day. And he has said over the years several things about Return of the Jedi and about there being an original version of Return of the Jedi that never saw the screen, in which Harrison Ford died, in which everything was a little darker. And sorry, I should say Han Solo died rather than Harrison Ford. There wasn't a Death Star, there weren't Ewoks, etc., etc. So this has sort of become part of the mythology of Star Wars, this notion that there was a different Return of the Jedi. And there were other interviews that he's done, and he's talked about, being influential in the creation of the concept of the Force. And he's talked about being influential in the starting Star Wars in the middle of the saga. And I really wanted to cut through that because obviously, that is at odds with kind of the official Lucasfilm history. in a lot of ways.
There's some other things that are definitely at odds with his own story as well. In that, in the official mythology, I caught Gary Kurtz at Dragon Con a few years ago, actually, which was weird. And basically, he kind of ascribes his departure to the fact that Return of the Jedi was too oriented toward toys. But that doesn't even necessarily jive with the timeline where he was out on Empire before it was even finished.
Right. I really wanted to get straight from the horse's mouth. And Gary is very hard to track down. He is all over the world. He has an office in London. He has a house in Wales. He spends a lot of time in LA still, in California. And when I spoke to him, he was on his way on a trip to China. And the guy is 74 years old now. And it's quite incredible because he was always a little older than George. He was kind of more of a experienced film guy at the time. He was experienced in film production. He'd been to Vietnam when George met him. They were going to do Apocalypse Now together for that reason. And he's just a very interesting figure, but he's very hard to pin down, as anyone who's ever tried to interview him will know. But I did finally get hold of him pretty much at the end of the process of writing the whole book, which turned out to be great because it meant that I could kind of get all my ducks in a row and I could throw all these questions at him that had been burning in my head since I started writing the book. And we came up with some interesting answers. I mean, he sort of debunked a lot of myths about Star Wars, from the relationship to the Hidden Fortress to, the Force mythology part of things. So, these clips, they're pretty interesting. They're sort of the most interesting parts of this epic 90-minute interview that we did, and a little too long to fill an entire podcast with. But these are the most interesting parts. The one thing I'll say about these clips we're going to listen to is this was an interview that was done for a book, which means that it's sort of necessarily a little different from how a podcast interview normally sounds. It's, we take our time a little bit more, a little bit slower. But hopefully in these examples, it's not going to be too slow for the podcast listeners.
No, and there's a lot of interesting things that come up, so it's well worth the wait.
Cool.
So what's the first clip we're going to be hearing?
So the first clip, just to ease us into it, this is I wanted to ask Gary about his relationship to space fantasy, and specifically Flash Gordon, which is the number one, sort of undisputed number one influence on Star Wars, but doesn't really get talked about all that much. And that's something I really wanted to address in the book. So the first clip, we start off talking about Flash Gordon and Gary's own experience of it. He turns out to be, I think, one of the few guys on the production team who actually saw Flash Gordon in the theater during its original run, rather than catching it on TV as George did. And then, we move on from that to talk about various other influences, including Hidden Fortress.
All right, well, let's play that clip.
So on the space fantasy beginnings, I wanted to sort of take you back and ask, were you a fan of Flash Gordon in your youth?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I remember I grew up in the 40s and went to Saturday morning pictures all the time, and I can remember watching Flash Gordon serials as part of the morning program with cartoons and a feature. So it was, yes, definite part of my growing up. I used to listen to, before television, I used to listen to Buck Rogers on the radio. There were radio episodes in America, and I grew up in California, and television really didn't come in until the mid-'50s, and it was 8 hours a week scattered around Friday and Saturday and Sunday evenings, so there wasn't much there. So it was mainly radio and comic books, and certainly Flash Gordon in the Sunday newspapers was very big because it was Alex Raymond, and his drawings covered the entire page. of a big newspaper. So it was pretty dramatic, actually.
Yeah, I actually went back and looked at all the early Alex Raymond art, and it's really it holds up so well.
It does. It's fantastic stuff.
Yeah.
We used one of the Alex Raymond drawings of Flash and Ming sword fighting as one of the script covers for an early draft of Star Wars.
I think I know the one you mean. Yeah, they're sort of fencing. Yeah. That's fantastic. Yeah, it seems like it's the origin of Star Wars is sort of clearly in plain sight, and a lot of people go off on this sort of mythological tangent, which is fine, had its place, but really, it seems like everyone's been talking about Flash Gordon for years, and not a lot of people have been listening. I mean,
well, we tried, I'm sure you know the stories about, we tried to buy the rights to Flash Gordon from King Features, and they weren't adverse to discussing it, but their restrictions were so draconian that we realized right away that it wasn't really a great prospect at the time.
So even before that, I mean, you've mentioned in other interviews that there was this one occasion where you and George were sort of trying to go see a movie, and you were looking in the local papers, I'm presuming in Marin, and you just didn't see anything you wanted to watch, and that's when you started talking about how great it would be to see Flash Gordon.
Yes, some kind of Flash Gordon-like science fiction story, which hadn't been done for a long, long time. I would say probably the last proper space opera type of science fiction was probably Forbidden Planet in 1955. And since then, all the science fiction seemed to go downhill towards either genre horror kind of movies, Creature from the Black Lagoon type, or alien invasions from space, or just this dystopian, nihilistic kind of depressing stories about post-apocalyptic society, and none of that was fun. So it was just the idea of capturing the energy of Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers style of space opera, really, which hadn't been done for so long that it was really during American Graffiti that we discussed it a lot, because it was on the paperwork when we made this deal with United Artists for two pictures. One was a 50s rock and roll movie, and one was an unnamed science fiction film, and that was about the extent of the description at the time. And there was no idea of what that science fiction movie would be like. And we did discuss science Flash Gordon type stories at great length, and also, I'm sure you know from reading the other interviews that at one time we thought about actually just adapting Hidden Fortress, Kurosawa's film, as a possible vehicle for a science fiction version, and that didn't go anywhere either. Actually,
right. It's sort of been overblown, the comparison to him.
Well, it has. I mean, there are definite comparisons. There's no question about it. If you want to look hard enough, the two farmers and the idea of transporting a princess across hostile territory. I mean, they're very generic, but the whole idea of Star Wars as a mythological thing, I think, came about because of the interviews that tied it to The Hero with 1,000 Faces. But that was actually, if you look carefully at it, that all coming-of-age stories fit that model. And Hollywood has done those kind of stories since the beginning, since the 1920s. And so there are many, many examples of stories that fit the model of the hero, of that hero. And I think it did kind of cloud it a bit that Star Wars got so closely tied to that, and it was even more so when George did that long interview with about the book and about the connections. And there are definite connections there, but I think they're a bit too analytical.
I like how old-timey it sounds, his answer. Yes, I remember I grew up in the 40s and went to the Saturday morning pictures.
It's interesting to me how I'd never even really known that they'd discussed just doing a straight copy of Hidden Fortress. Which would have made sense. And I mean, anybody who's seen Hidden Fortress and Star Wars back to back knows that there's a few spiritual markers that tie the two together, but nothing structurally similar.
Well, what I like is that the mythologizing about the making of Star Wars, the sort of stuff that Star Wars fans like to drop on other Star Wars fans or nascent Star Wars fans, that those sorts of storytelling, because, Star Wars came about because of this, and this guy did this, and it was going to be, a remake of the Hidden Fortress. And then a lot of people go and they watch the Hidden Fortress for the first time. A lot of people's first Kurosawa movie does end up being the Hidden Fortress, primarily because it gets name-checked so much in regards to Star Wars. And then you watch the Hidden Fortress, and I feel like some people come away from it disappointed because it doesn't really line up much more than, okay, well, there's a R2 and 3PO analog, and there's a guy who's helping a princess across a hostile environment, and that's basically it.
Yeah, I thought it was a prerequisite to actually watch Hidden Fortress for Kurosawa. That's the first one.
It was interesting. The reason I picked up Hidden Fortress for the first time is because Toho was using that as a sales pitch.
Yeah.
On the cover of the VHS tapes that I rented at the library, it said the film that inspired Star Wars, and that's why I watched it. And I had already seen Seven Samurai at that point, and I was super into Kurosawa. And I mean, there's other touchstones too. I think in editing, you can actually editing and lens choices. You can actually there's a lot of the Death Star trench, believe it or not, in Hidden Fortress. But yeah, it's not the same.
Mm-hmm.
Right. There was one paragraph that George cribbed from in a early treatment of Star Wars, not even one of the early drafts, where he basically cribbed a paragraph from a book that described the movies of Kurosawa. But even, I mean, George has said that Kurosawa's, his favorite Kurosawa movie, I think like the rest of us, is Seven Samurai. And Hidden Fortress was only his fourth favorite, but it had this sort of simplistic storyline that they were actually talking about evolving into an American-style movie at some point, much as Seven Samurai had recently evolved into Magnificent Seven.
Yeah, I love that Lucas actually tried to make, Hidden Fortress is my fourth favorite Kurosawa film. Like, he tried to make that sound like that was impressive in interviews. Like, it's my fourth favorite Kurosawa movie.
Well, I wonder what his other two were. Was it like...
Yeah, I mean, it made it into the top 5 at least.
What
notable?
What were the other two? Probably like Kiru and maybe Rashomon, just because that's what everybody says.
Yeah. Well, your Jimbo and
your Jimbo.
Yeah, which definitely has echoes in Star Wars itself. I believe that's the one with the cantina scene.
Oh, screw you guys. That's like Stray Dog. You didn't even name check Stray Dog. You don't think I'm that deep, do you?
Well, he did do an episode of Clone Wars based on Stray Dog.
See, I think you get a decent insight as to what of Kurosawa's he values if you watch Clone Wars, because he definitely had a strong hand in what, the direction of the episodes. And there are some overt Kurosawa references that I'm not entirely sure are all Filoni's doing. So
no, I think they're all George's.
Yeah. So anyway.
So one more thing. So right at the end of that clip, you'll notice that he basically destroys another Star Wars myth, which is the connection with Hero with 1,000 Faces, the Joseph Campbell book, which, again, this is something that has been overblown in the mythologizing of the Star Wars story, of how Star Wars was made, and was much more influential later in the saga. But with the original book, it sort of came along very, very late in the process. And my best guess is that, Lucas found it at the end of the third draft and sort of adapted the fourth a little bit along those lines, but basically he'd been working along those lines anyway, kind of subconsciously. And as Kurtz says, it's a coming-of-age story in many ways, and they've followed the same model in Hollywood since the 20s. So
Well, it's interesting to me too that Kurtz says that afterwards, like once you hit Empire Strikes Back, the rest of the trilogy hits that hero's journey note for note. Which is interesting that Return of the Jedi is so reviled by him, but it's following that pattern that he said that they'd set up for Empire.
right, that's the hero coming up out of the underworld at that point. Yeah.
So it's interesting. I don't know. Kurtz he's very full of interesting cognitive dissonances.
That's a lot of big words. Let me just say that what was said earlier about how a lot of the storylines and a lot of how things were set up in movies have been going on since the beginning of movies. So things are going to pop up, and people will be inspired or influenced by movies that they see. And people that watched the original trilogy are inspired making movies now. J.J. Abrams and a whole slew of other directors. So
I don't think it's a bad thing.
I don't think it's a bad thing either, but I get a little annoyed with people when they go, "Oh well, you know this and you know that." So what?
Yeah, and also, I mean, George is a huge movie buff, and he's, so far as we know, watched every movie under the sun. Certainly, every classic movie, and you can see those echoes. I mean, if you're sitting there day after day in your own screening room, watching whatever you feel like getting, in the 70s, it was you had to get the film reels and loan them from film archives and sit there and watch them yourself. But we know he did this, and Brian has been doing some excellent work on StarWars.com with the history of Star Wars cinema and the echoes, many of them sort of unconscious echoes, but slightly conscious echoes in movies like most recently Casablanca, which I thought was a great piece, Brian.
Oh, thank you. That was a dare. Cole Horton on StarWars.com, he writes the history of World War II and Star Wars, like those similarities columns. And we were at Comic-Con, and he sort of dared me. He's like, "Oh, you think you can connect up any movie to Star Wars? How about this? Try Casablanca." And it took me all of about 4 seconds of thinking. I'm like, well, you've got Sidney Greenstreet, and the whole cantina is basically, it's like, it writes itself. And I'm like, I'll make that my next column just for you.
Did he think he was throwing you a fastball with that?
Yeah.
And he was offering up a knuckleball over the plate or something? Like, he basically pitched you underhand a basketball from 30 feet.
I'm going to stump him on this one, guys. Here it is.
That's how I felt.
All right, so what's the next clip there? Now that Mr. Kurtz has both sort of bolstered and debunked at the same time some of the myths behind how Star Wars came to be as far as filmic inspiration goes.
So this next clip, we're talking a little bit more about the name, the name The Star Wars, which of course is what it originally was. It didn't drop the definite article until 1976. It was The Star Wars throughout most of the process. And what Kurtz is talking about here is how that name came about, because I've been fascinated by this question. It seems to be the one major unanswered question in every George Lucas interview. It's like, how did you come up with the name The Star Wars? Was it influenced by, and I mentioned the two theories in this clip, was it influenced by the Space Soldiers, which is what the original TV version of Flash Gordon was called? Or was it influenced by Star Trek, which George has talked about watching? And this is his answer. Now, we started off talking about United Artists, who were, of course, the first studio to have the option on Star Wars, and they were also the first to register the copyright on the name The Star Wars, which they'd let go of much later on. More fool them. But so that's where we start with this clip.
All right, here it is.
Now, it seems United Artists, at least according to the Making of Star Wars book, we have this document where United Artists copyrights the name The Star Wars. And that seems to be the first emergence of the title. And I don't suppose you remember anything about how the title got started, or whether George...
No, it was just about, the discussion about it was that it was, a Flash Gordon-like space opera type adventure about wars in outer space, and that kind of gestated into Star Wars, or The Star Wars, which is the way it was for a long time.
Yeah, I sort of had these kind of two minor theories about it. One was that it was influenced by Space Soldiers, which is what Flash Gordon was called when they when they showed it on TV in the 50s when George was watching it. They had to put the Space Soldiers title on it. And then the other idea was, of course, Star Trek was coming back in syndication at the time. And George has talked a lot about how he used to watch it when he was taking breaks from writing. So I don't know if that was a component in any way. Do you remember either of those being influences at all?
Yes, he did talk about that quite a bit. I mean, Star Trek was, in the early series on TV, was pretty much all human drama. There wasn't any... there was a touch of humor in it, but as I recall, most of it was down to relationship stories. There wasn't much in the way of intergalactic battles. They didn't have any money anyway, so it was difficult for them. But it was set in this kind of futuristic kind of environment that was inspiring in a way, because it freed up the mind to think about, well, gee, what would it be like to travel to distant galaxies and encounter other species? I think that definitely was one of the influences, because that's what Flash Gordon was like too. So.
Yeah, there's definitely a connection between Flash Gordon and Captain Kirk, I think. Very similar in a lot of ways. And, I was talking to Patrick Reed Johnson, the guy who did 525-77.
Yes, I know. I was involved in helping him get that picture made.
Yes, he mentioned you call him Fan One, and, which is great. But he was obviously a fan at the time, a fan of Star Trek. And he had this very interesting quote to me. He said something about, it was when you heard Star Wars, when you heard those two words together in the mid-70s, before it came out, it just sounded ridiculous. It sounded like someone had started out saying Star Trek, and then they just dropped the Trek and just said Wars. So, he definitely heard that reference to Star Trek in it. So I don't know if that's a common reaction that you had at the time.
I think that was a fairly common reaction. I remember that Fox had some of their marketing people out in shopping malls around asking people if they would go see a film called Star Wars, or was it confusing it with Star Trek? And they asked about 20 questions, and what came back was that yes, some people did confuse it with Star Trek, but the majority of the people wouldn't go see a film with war in the title. And so that's one of the reasons they wanted us to change the title. And it was another one of those cases of, okay, we don't have a better title right now, but if you can come up with one, fine, we'll consider it. And they never did.
Yeah, I guess they just didn't. It seems like Fox just didn't care that much about it to actually come up with a title. Why bother if it's going to be a failure, right?
Well, yes. I mean, there wasn't a lot of people there that was really that interested in it.
Yeah, I don't believe in the stars. Let me tell you.
I like that there's quite a bit more out of this decade stupid ass fight over Star Trek versus Star Wars. This fight that has gone on between the two fandoms for going on 40 years now. I like that there is now more howitzers to roll up to the front lines of this particular fight.
And I'm kind of surprised.
I'm
surprised that hasn't come out before, to be honest.
Yeah, I know. I was sort of surprised when I was listening to it the first time. I was like, oh, it was straight up, yeah, Star Trek. The next progression is, of course, Star Wars. They are very solidly linked. Now, that link hadn't really been acknowledged all that much. And for the longest time, while we're talking about the mythologizing of making Star Wars and the mythologizing of even being a Star Wars fan, because Star Wars fans love to mythologize everything. It can't just be a story. It can't just be what happened. There has to be a mythology that sprouts up around all these things that are important to Star Wars fans. But
right. It has to be the hero's journey.
Exactly. Everything has to be a hero's journey. And for the longest time, that story was told as, well, Star Trek wouldn't even exist if Star Wars hadn't been a big thing in 77, Star Trek wouldn't have even been revived. And now Star Wars more than likely probably wouldn't have ever been called Star Wars if Star Trek hadn't inspired George Lucas. Like, that's definite now, straight from Gary Kurtz's bearded mouth.
Brian, what do you have to think about this clip? What do you have to say about it?
It's really interesting to me. I never really realized that there was like, it's always hard for me to get behind something that says like, how did you come up with Star Wars? Because as far as I'm aware, Star Wars has always existed. It's like echoes the name of the rose. Like, all I have to do is I have to take everyone's word for it that a world existed before Star Wars. So it's interesting to hear these debates, and I don't care that Star Trek inspired it. I'm glad. I'm grateful for it. I love Star Trek as much as anybody. Mm-hmm. I'm not in love with it like I am with Star Wars, but I think it is circular.
I'm a star polygamist. There's lots of stars. I love Battlestar.
Star Galactica.
I love Star Trek just as much as I love Star Wars. There's so much love and so many stars. Share with as much as possible. Babylon 5 sucks, though. I've never liked it.
They should have named Firefly Firestar, and then it would have made a lot more sense.
The other interesting thing I wanted to pull out that Kurt says at the end there is that we might not have called it Star Wars if Fox had cared more about the title. Basically said, you go away and come up with a better title. And they never did, because they just didn't care about it.
And that was like something they do frequently. Like early on in Lucasfilm's career, they were like, all right, well, if you like the title better, or if you think you can come up with a better title, do so. And they just knew that the studio never would, because they're a studio.
It's the same with American Graffiti. The studio hated that. They wanted to call it Another Quiet Night in Modesto.
Which is the stupidest title ever.
And, they thought it was a movie about feet, because it had feet within graffiti.
Wait, so you wouldn't have gone to Another Quiet Night in Modesto, Brian? You wouldn't have...
That doesn't sound thrilling at all. Like, why would I want a movie about a quiet night?
I'm going to spend $4. Me and my date, we're going to go sit in a theater and watch A Quiet Night in Modesto. It's like two prairie dogs having sex, and then the moon comes up. Like, what? That's not a movie that sounds altogether appealing to me as a film goer. American Graffiti, okay, even if it does sound like Italian Feet, the movie, that's at least somewhat exotic. I might check that out.
The thing is that there's too much. If you take the trailer for American Graffiti with the music and the feel and the vibe and the neon and put that to A Quiet Night in Modesto, like, it doesn't match. Yeah. Like, at least with American Graffiti, it's like, oh, they're being a little bit out there and esoteric with the title. I get it, but the music sells it.
I always thought it was filmed in Petaluma, not Modesto. I don't know why.
Right. It was, but it was supposed to be a stand-in for Modesto.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Fancy movie stuff going on there. It's like filming in Toronto and saying that you're in Vancouver.
Exactly. Yeah, it was always, it was never mentioned in the movie that it is Modesto, but that's certainly the intention, that it is the town of George Lucas's childhood.
I don't know what they'll say anymore on that one.
All right, so now that we've got the title out of the way, we've got the inspirations for the movie itself, the idea for the movie, and we've gotten the inspirations for the title all sort of squared off. What's the next clip? What's the next bit of wisdom that Gary Kurtz is going to drop on our heads?
So a couple of things coming up in this next clip. The first one is the Force, and I'll say more about that a little bit because it needs a little bit of lead in here. But the second thing is this whole notion of starting the saga in the middle, in media res, as they say in storytelling class. Just literally starting in the middle of things. And this is something that Star Wars does quite famously. You're just dropped in at the beginning of what turns out to be Episode 4. And there's been a lot of debate over years over whether Episode 4 was what George intended to put on the screen at the beginning of the scroll back in 77, because, of course, it wasn't there in the original version of the movie. George has said that he chickened out, or that Fox wouldn't let him. He said both those things on different occasions. And Gary does sort of back that up. He basically says, we were thinking of calling it Episode 3 or 4 or 5 or something like that, somewhere in the middle. But it sounded dumb. And he's saying basically it was the right choice to go out in 77 without Episode 4 at the start. And then he addresses right at the end, is one of the more interesting things here. He addresses the concept that George has repeated almost ad nauseam in these interviews since, that he took his first draft of the script, which has famously been released as a comic book, the Star Wars, so we should all be familiar with that first draft now, and he chopped it in half, and he took the second half, and he chopped that into thirds, and he took the first third, and then that was episode 4. Now, Gary has absolutely no time for this notion whatsoever, as you'll hear. So that's right at the end, but at the beginning, we're talking about the Force, and this is something that Kurtz has sort of claimed a little bit in recent interviews, or not so recent interviews, about a decade ago, actually, that he was responsible for kind of narrowing down the concept of the Force that existed in earlier scripts. So in the second and third drafts, George gets into this notion of the Ashlar Force, which is the good side, and the Bogan Force, which is the dark side, and talks about them an awful lot. And there's an awful lot of mythology, and you have something called the Kyber crystal, which is supposedly the repository of all of the Force. And then suddenly in the fourth draft, it's not there. So that's where we start here, with me asking Gary about what that process was like and what his role was in it.
All right, here it is.
So there is one important change that takes place between the third and the fourth drafts. So in the third, George is still talking about this, the Force as, the Bogan Force and the Ashlar Force, and he has this very complicated version of it. And then you've said it on one occasion that you were, because you were a comparative religion student, I believe.
Yes, partially. Yeah.
That there was this time where you sat down with George and you guys had this long discussion about religion and about boiling the Force down to its simplest form.
Yes, I mean that was always a huge bugaboo, because at one time, even before all of that, it was all tied up. The energy was all tied up in the crystal, in the Kyber crystal, and that was the source of the Force's energy. But the obvious fact was that we had no time to deal with exposition about esoteric religion, and what we were looking for was a simple handle on something that could be explained really quickly. When you're out in the world, in the real world, and you talk to people about religion is identified by handles, and you're either a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or a Buddhist or Hindu, whatever it is, and as soon as you say one of those words, you know what's behind that, sort of. Even if you haven't studied any of those religions, you know kind of what that person might be like, and we wanted something like that with a with a religion that nobody had ever heard of, and was more esoteric than conventional religions. And so the idea of the Force is this energy thing, and the fact that Ben Kenobi could say in one sentence, pretty much, what it was all about, and then we just move on, and it would just be part of the floating part of the story, and we wouldn't have to refer to it very much.
Right.
That was the holy grail for us, is to not have a major exposition about what the hell this was, and that's how it got boiled down to practically nothing, and it worked much better that way, much better.
So was that your influence? Because it seems like George's instinct.
I think part of it was because we did have long discussions about various religious philosophies and how people related to them, and how we could simplify it. It's kind of like the term "May the Force be with you" came out of medieval Christianity, in a way, where your greeting was "May God go with you," as a symbol of that you would be safe. And we wanted something as simple as that, something that was an everyday expression that was said, that linked to the power of the Force, but wasn't overbearing.
Mm. Yes.
And in the end, it kind of boils down to that. Sometimes you have to spend time with it and then say it a lot. And there's a lot of times when dialogue looks good on paper and then you say it out loud and you cringe. So so with things like that, end up getting spoken out a lot and saying, "Do you really think this is going to work for us?" So yes, I mean, of course, that Willard and Gloria Haidt came in at the last minute and did what essentially was a comedy polish, and they had some other ideas too that were very good, and that helped immensely because that last draft before their influence was a little too serious.
Right. So. Yeah, I mean, something else that you sort of mentioned that you talked to George a lot about was this idea of starting in media res in the middle of things, and and that's something else that you start to see creeping into the drafts.
Yes, the idea that we don't have to explain the beginning of anything, and that goes back to, that's not just my idea. It goes back to the Flash Gordon thing, because if you went to Saturday Morning Pictures and came in and saw episode 8 of Flash Gordon, you'd have this scroll at the beginning, this roll-up, which we imitated.
Right.
And it tried to explain what happened before a little bit. It usually referred to a couple of events in the previous episode, and we wanted to try to capture the flavor of that. And that roll-up was supposed to do that. And it was rewritten dozens and dozens of times. And I think that several other people had a go at the roll-up as well. I think that
Brian De Palma.
Brian De Palma claims that his version is the one that's used, and I can't remember anymore. I mean, I think it was an amalgamation of several of them.
Right.
Just to give it enough of a flavor about the previous episode, and we were toying with the idea of calling it episode 3, 4, 5, something in the middle at the beginning. And Fox hated that idea. They said it'll really confuse the audience, and actually they were right at that time, because if you go to see a film and it's been touted as this new science fiction film, and it says episode 3 up there, you say, "What the hell?
Yep.
Did I miss the other ones?" we were a bit clouded by the fact that we wanted it to be as much like Flash Gordon as possible, and so we thought that would be really clever, but it wasn't really clever. It was just stupid at the time, because it would be impossible to explain to anybody what it meant.
Yeah, George seems to like to say that, he had these ideas definitely fully formed in his mind, but, even the title of the script was, Adventures of Luke Skywalker Episode 1, the Star Wars, so
yeah.
It clearly wasn't, it may have been in his mind, but it wasn't as serious as he later made it.
No, I mean, I think that it's very easy in hindsight to make things a lot simpler than they actually were.
Another thing that he does in hindsight is he has this whole story about how he wrote the first draft, and then he chopped it in half, and then he chopped that second half into thirds, and then he took the first third and he made the movie out of that. But that's really... No,
that's not true. I mean, there were, as you've seen from those drafts, there were a lot of little bits and pieces that were reasonably good ideas, and that ended up being in the final draft. But once the final draft was actually locked, and the Hikes did their polish on it, there wasn't enough material to do other movies. There were some odd ideas that got thrown out, like the Wookiee planet and other things that were cost factors. Just couldn't do them for time and cost. And there were some other ideas that we had thought about that might have been able to be included if there was more budget. And so some of those ended up in later films. But the idea that, and this is perpetuated by the fact that both George and I did interviews at the time of the opening of Star Wars, saying, "Well, there was we took a section out of the middle because there's too much material, and we want to do it. We want to do more films, and because after the film opened, Fox said, "Can you do another one?" And we said, "Well, it's possible, but for cost purposes, it'd be better if we committed to 2 more, because we can amortize the costs of sets and everything that way." And so that's really what happened. But the story material was not fully formed then.
All right, so it seems like Gary Kurtz is definitely the one to thank for making the Force maybe not be the concept that we're all familiar with, but streamlining it down so that the simplicity that seems to resonate with so many Star Wars fans is there. Like, that seems to be mostly a Gary Kurtz thing. Is that correct?
I mean, he's sort of, it's interesting here because he's sort of careful not to claim any credit for it, which he did in earlier interviews. And I think that he's been burned by that a little bit, or maybe he's just getting older and mellowing out and kind of
doesn't bother him as
wanting
much
to set the record straight. But
or maybe he's just getting older and forgetting stuff. Like, that's entirely possible. Go
ahead, Brian.
It's a little hard to take credit for something if and it sounds like he's basically saying, like, I helped George talk through it, which is what a producer's supposed to do.
Yeah.
And so
I just sort of right there fell into that sort of fanish trap that I was decrying just a few minutes ago about, sort of reducing things from the collaborative aspect that all movies are made with, and being more about trying to assign credit so one creator possibly has more points than the other creator, and therefore we can then say that this guy is really the reason that Star Wars plays the way that it plays. But it really does seem, listening to that audio, that George, which George is known for doing, was tending to overcomplicate the notion of the Force up until he and Gary Kurtz had to sit down and talk through it.
I think there's something interesting in there too, like where you take the bits taken together with the explanation of the Force and taken together with the idea that he'd written all these pieces and kind of cut them in half to get the other episodes. I mean, Chris, you've gone through and you've read all the different drafts of Star Wars, and I think probably most of us have, that that explanation could have been more of a shorthand, that all those ideas that I had were there and they're just coming out with different iterations, where you've got things like, Mace Windu or Padawans or the Bogan. The Bogan side of the Force turned into the Bogan monster in Revenge of the Sith, or the Kyber crystals made their ways into the movies, things like that, where he didn't necessarily have the giant story we're thinking of, and he didn't literally cut it in thirds, but he had enough material and ideas for what those could spin out to be.
For sure.
Yeah. And pulled it all along.
He is excellent at recycling things. That is one of George's ninja skills, that there was never a concept anywhere in Star Wars that didn't somehow pop up again.
I just got the craziest mental image of George Lucas in black pajamas putting his wine bottles out on the curb Tuesday night. George Lucas, recycle ninja. Like, nobody ever saw him. Just, I was walking down the street. All of a sudden, boom, a big yellow basket full of wine bottles. I have no idea how that got there. And George is giggling on the rooftop somewhere.
That is a good mental image. I don't know. Going through their book, Chris, and listening to these clips, I guess maybe I haven't read enough into it or looked enough into it, or I was ignorant to the fact, but it seems like Kurtz had a lot more to do with it than I originally thought.
Well, he has presented a number of different takes on this, and I think this is sort of, now we're getting further away from it. He has more time to think about it. He doesn't need to kind of puff himself up so much. I think we're getting sort of the true settlement of things, because he's not saying, I created the Force. He's not saying, I made sure that we started in the middle of things. He's just saying there were these discussions. He's not using the word I anywhere in there. He's just saying this is where it ended up. And I think that's sort of, there's something very powerful about the nature of creativity being said here, which is just, it's everything is better when it's collaborative. Yeah. When you bounce stuff off people and ideas emerge, and then decades later, you can't even tell who said what or who imagined what in the first place. And it may not even matter. What matters is that you just sat down and you discussed it. You bounced it off
you came up with something that 40 years later is a huge deal to, a billion people.
Exactly.
What I liked about that clip is that it ended up both sort of supporting and then negating the ideas that we've all sort of had about how Star Wars, came together in script form and how much story there really was. It turns out, the idea was to sort of always say that it was just one chapter and it was one of the middle chapters in this large story. That was actually the case. But what was not the case was that he did have this giant tome of Star Wars lore that he ended up having to cut away until he got the Star Wars movie that he wanted. And it turned out he barely had enough material, no matter how big those scripts were. Like he barely had, enough material to fill 1 and 1/2 movies, not 6 movies.
I think it's really interesting too that you see the revisionist in Lucas kind of in those statements where it's like, well, Fox thought it would be confusing to add that, episode 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever, and Fox is probably right, but they waited for the movie to be a hit. And then they came out and said, okay, well, let's do these 2 movies. And then they were like, well, we could change this and set this up better and revise it a little bit. I mean, you can see that going back all the way to 78, and Kurtz was very supportive of that then when he was involved.
Yeah.
Maybe not as much later when Rick McCallum took the Kurtz chair.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So Kurtz was at that famous Grauman's Chinese Theater moment where Darth Vader and 3PO and R2 had their footprints etched into the concrete outside the theater. And at that event, he said to some reporters, he was like, we're not necessarily going to do a sequel for the next movie. There are so many ways we can go with this. And I think that really was the thinking at the time. It's like we could turn this into more of a James Bond franchise. I mean, they had, of course, Splinter of the Mind's Eye already ready to go as a potential script that Alan Dean Foster had already written before the original movie had even come out, with the notion that this could be the script for the second movie if it doesn't do so well, if they don't have that much of a budget.
And that's a story Alan Dean Foster's talked a lot about. How they kind of said, like, listen, if we're going to have to make a sequel to this because no one will pay for it, make it really cheap. Which is why everything was in the mist and everything was on one planet. And,
and they cut out a space battle in the beginning just to get rid of the big budget stuff.
They always use that expression, the world is their oyster. Back then in 78, I mean, it really was. They could have gone any way.
So it's kind of almost a last minute decision to continue the story. And certainly it seems like that was the point at which George starts to think about things like Darth Vader's castle with the lava in it. All of these images that would pop up and sort of get refocused and recycled throughout the rest of the series. And it's fascinating to see. It's definitely a guy who had more ideas than he could cope with
his wine bottles.
Lucas, you recycle ninja. The recycle ninja strikes again. From what I understand, the Recycle Ninja Strikes Again was one of the original titles for The Empire Strikes Back. That's true.
I'm not going to be able to get that image of George Lucas in pajamas.
Yeah, no. It's stuck there for good.
In Count Dooku's pajamas from Clone Wars.
But what Brian did say earlier did sort of spark my imagination once again, in that people were so surprised by the special editions and then, the further revisions to the original trilogy as they went on. And, the quotes that we're hearing, stuff like the making of books that J.W. Rinsler worked on, and the book that Chris just turned out, which is full of information, and the myriad other making of books, Dale Pollock's book, Skywalking, that other book, Mythmaker, all this information about the Star Wars movies and how they became such a cultural touchstone. And we didn't even realize that we're reading through and we're noting the differences between George's story and Kurtz's story and George's story as compared to its own story, right? We didn't even really realize that George Lucas had been practicing the art of revising what we'd already heard for decades. He was just doing it to us.
The more I think about it, the more there's Simon Kinberg, when I talked to him, which we'll have some clips of that interview on the show maybe next week. He was talking about how this is like adding chapters to the Bible, doing this new stuff. But and George Lucas in his interview with where was it? He was talking about how the problem with these big special effects is they're meant to be seen on the big screen, and that home video is the enemy of all of that because people can frame by frame it and see all the differences. But it's like as soon as home video came around, that's when it solidified in people's minds. No one noticed when it was just coming out in the theaters. It was fluid and it was okay. Same with the Bible, where you look at all the different verses of the Bible and they change every single draft depending on who's putting it out. And then the printing press happens and it's static. It never changes again. And then when it does, there's riots.
Plus, there's an Old Testament and a New Testament that came out at different times.
Well, you get what I'm saying.
Yes.
Though that as soon as home video hit and people were able to consume it abundantly, it was the enemy of what Lucas was doing. Because if we were to go see the special editions just in the theater, if we didn't have the ability to go back and revisit them and watch them on the big screen, we wouldn't remember the differences between the releases.
What fun would that be, though?
I'm just saying, it's interesting to see like his philosophy grew out of a way of consuming films that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chris, so all the clips that you sent, this one is the juiciest of them all. It's the longest too, but tell us what's going to happen in this one.
So I just want to precede this by making one more point about all of these clips in general, which is that I don't, that there's no agenda here with any of these clips. I mean, there's no agenda with the book in general. I just wanted to sort of see if I could nail down the truth of all of this. And there is, I don't want anyone to come out of this thinking that Kurtz is sort of attacking Lucas on all of these points. There are some parts of Star Wars mythology he's backing up, some that he's shooting down. And that's sort of the case throughout the book. A lot of people think midichlorians was something George came up with at the last minute in Phantom Menace. In fact, he first mentioned them back in 1977. A lot of people think he just came up with the scene with Jabba the Hutt in, that he pulled it out of the editing bin in 1997 for the special edition.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a lot of evidence that shows that he wanted to insert that sort of maybe back as early as 81, or he may have shot it if he'd had more money back in 1977. So the truth is always gray. It's always nuanced here, and never more so in this next bit we're getting to, which covers The Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and first of all, the holiday special. So that's where we start. I really, Gary Kurtz was as involved in theory as George Lucas with the holiday special, which is to say not very much. But they both had their names on it. And one of the interesting things that he's talking about here is this notion that Fox kind of nudged them into doing the holiday special because they thought, well, 3 years is way too long a time for Star Wars to be off the screen. So we got to put something in here. So we start off with the holiday special, we move into Empire Strikes Back, and then we get to those sort of controversial accusations about Return of the Jedi, which is where we'll finish this clip.
No, we'll enjoy this because this was my favorite one of the four.
So the Star Wars holiday special, let's cover that briefly, because you and George both took your names off the project once you saw how it turned out. I mean,
absolutely, yes.
It doesn't seem like it was always going to be that way, and someone actually dug up an early script. I think in 2010 they found among Ralph McQuarrie's papers an early version of the script, which sounded like it was a lot better.
Yes, it did start out to be a lot better. We had half a dozen meetings with the TV company that was making it, and in the end, because of work on promoting Star Wars and working on the next film, we realized we had no time, and so we just left it to them and just had occasional meetings with them, provided them with access to props and the actors, and that was it. And we were kind of appalled as it got toward airtime. It's exactly what was happening with it, and so everybody just kind of walked away. it was a bad mistake, and it wasn't, in the long run, it wouldn't have been necessary even to do anything with it, because Fox was worried that 3 years was too long to wait for the second film, and that something needed to be out there in the meantime, and it really didn't.
Yeah, but it seems to have definitely influenced George in kind of asserting more control from that point on.
Yes.
Yeah. So to skip forward to Empire, so I talked to Howard Kazanjian, and he says that George sort of had him in mind maybe early on as a producer for Empire, and that there seems to be some confusion about how exactly you guys swapped over and what happened there. So what's your take on it?
Well, Howard was around. He was doing American Graffiti 2.
Right.
And I was, all during this time, I was talking to Jim Henson about The Dark Crystal, because he wanted to go ahead with it. And I said, I can't do it because tied up with the Star Wars things. And George and I had a long talk about that, and I said that I was committed to doing the picture, and this is after Kirsch was picked. So I had worked with Kirsch before, and so it just kind of transitioned through the script and things into just going ahead and proceeding as we had done before. I think that one of the things that came up with that, I think George had it in mind that he could direct the film remotely by just telling Kirsch what to do, and Kirsch was not that kind of director. He when George only came over a few times during the shooting, and Kirsch told him, said, "Look, you hired me to make this movie. I'm going to make it." So, he did. He was a bit slow sometimes, and we did have to use a second unit a couple of times. I directed the second unit after John Barry died suddenly,
right.
In the first week. So that threw us for a bit, and then we had accidents on Empire. We had Mark Hamill had an accident, sprained his wrist or arm, and couldn't do anything for a little while, and so it wasn't all smooth sailing, and it did run long, but and of course we had weather problems in Norway, where we went very long in Norway. We had the worst blizzard in Northern Europe in the last 40 years. So one of those typical things. Right. Where I don't think I've ever been to a movie location anywhere where a local hasn't come up at one point and saying, "Gee, you should have been here last year. The weather was a lot better."
It does seem to happen a lot. So it just sort of inevitably overran, and it sounds like Kirsch was hard to rein in that.
He was. He was very good with the actors, and he was a bit slow, and the visual effects team was made fun of him sometimes, because they would, he would stage a scene, and they would say, "Okay, Boba Fett's going to shoot at Luke here, so you want bullet hits here and here," and they'd mark on the wall. They'd mark in pencil these marks where they're going to drill holes and put these squibs in. And inevitably they'd say, "You sure now? You sure this is where you want them?" and so they drill the holes, they put the squibs in and cover them up and everything, and then he'd do a rehearsal, and then he'd change his mind, and they'd have to put new ones in somewhere else.
Oh God, that's so frustrating. And of course you're watching all this happening, and you know that it's George's money, but it's what can you do, right?
Yeah, it's I tried to rein him in a bit, and by taking over the second unit, I was able to get some of the stuff done, like Luke in the ice cave with the Wampa, for instance. I shot all that, and Peter Shishitsky, who was the cameraman, who was very, very helpful in terms of making sure that the lighting in the second unit matched the first unit, and everybody worked really hard. And I think Kirsch did an outstanding job. The difference between Star Wars and Empire from a performance point of view is, I think, striking. And it's not only better written, but the performances are much less comic booky and more and darker and more realistic.
Very true.
But I did have. But in the meantime, George had worked with Stephen on Raiders of the Lost Ark, and he was convinced by the end of Empire that we needed a less serious story and more roller coaster rides. So he changed the story outline for Jedi, and we had a kind of mutual parting of the ways, because I just didn't want to do another attack on a Death Star, and the original story outline that we had for the third film, I thought, would have been great. It was darker, and it ended up with Luke riding off into the sunset, metaphorically, on his own, and that would have been a bittersweet ending. But I think it would have been dramatically stronger. But anyway, that's a minor thing, because it wasn't ever that way. It never was shot that way. That was just a story discussion.
So it wasn't even, I mean, in making of Return of the Jedi, which just came out last year, where they sort of, I mean, it's Lucasfilm's own account, admittedly, but they've kind of gone through the archives and looked at the early versions. And, there doesn't seem to be anything like, what you were describing there with, Luke going off into the sunset. It seems like there were 2 Death Stars. Earlier
there was, this all came up at the time that Empire was being written, because the idea was, since both pictures, they had to tie together, and I had some written material written down somewhere, but it was about how we're going to resolve the story of these 3 people, and one of the discussions was about the Han Solo character being killed in one of the raids in the middle of the story, once he's recovered from Boba Fett putting him in the in the carbon freezing chamber. That he gets killed on a raid, and Harrison wanted it to be that way. He wanted his character to end that way. But I think what happened was that there were discussions with the marketing people and the toy companies, and they said, "Oh no, you can't do that. Can't kill off one of your main characters. He's too sellable." And that, in a way, that still happens today with superhero movies. There's no poignancy anywhere. It's just a lot of action, but there's no threat to anybody. Nobody of our main characters, I mean. So I guess that's inevitable in this kind of situation where nobody wants to lose anything like that's important. So there was that, and there was the princess having to there was a discussion about the princess having to take control of what's left of her people and be crowned queen and things. And anyway, I'm not sure that ever got down to a complete story outline. It was just dismissed very early on as being possibly too melancholic and not upbeat enough for a big ending.
Right. That's definitely something George was talking about during Empire.
Yeah. And the idea of having a fairly strong climax for the third film that was rousing.
Not to break away from this clip too much, but people get interviewed a million times. Kurt's been interviewed a million times. Lucas, and you tell these stories. And when you're talking to your friends, and you tell a story to one friend, and I'll tell it to Brian, then I'll tell it to Bobby. And by the time I get to Chris, the story isn't exactly the same as the same one that I told Brian. And things change over time, and your opinion changes over time, and things are always different. So it's interesting to listen to this or to read about it, and then in 5 years you're going to hear something else, and it might be some backtracking or a different part of the story. I like that there's a lot of different places to choose from to listen to different things.
Yeah, there's definitely a game of telephone that goes on and is the bane of historians, not just of Star Wars, but across the field of history. This is
actual
a huge
historians.
problem.
Well, the winners always, dictate what's written in the history books.
I think it's interesting about the holiday special. The more I listen to this stuff, and the more I hear people talk about it, I think the holiday special is actually what gave us the licensing machine we have today. Where it's like, yeah, sure, do whatever you want to. We're kind of busy on this Empire thing. And they did what they wanted to, and it was awful. And then they built in the wake of that, a licensing apparatus that kept way more control over those things. That it was sort of that mistake. And Star Wars built what that licensing apparatus looks like today for every property.
All right, so you're saying I should thank the holiday special for all my toys. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Excellent.
Not all your toys per se, but the way the property is handled going forward, and the way all properties are handled going forward. The holiday special burned them so bad that they had to come up with some way to prevent it from happening again. And sure, they made the Ewok movies, but I found some old Bantha tracks, and they were interviewing the director of the Ewok movies, and they were treating it in the fan magazines as though it was like the second coming of Star Wars. And it could be, depending on if you're, under the age of 7 when it came on. But I think the holiday special burned them in the right ways.
Well, the Ewok movies is actually a great example of how the holiday special affected them, because that's why they added that Burl Ives narration in the first Ewok movie, because they realized, hey, we're in exactly the same situation as we were the holiday special, which just had 30 minutes of Wookiees grunting for the first, the opening of the holiday special. And they were like, okay, this Ewok movie threatens to turn into the same thing. Let's put this folksy narration over it.
Yeah, it's probably a wise choice.
Yeah.
If there's anything to a wise choice about that. But
I also like how he's addressing both the Return of the Jedi and Empire Strikes Back controversies, where he just flat out says, look, there was never a version on paper of Return of the Jedi of the Return of the Jedi that I wanted to see. A lot of people just sort of assumed, based on his previous comments, that at some point his version of Return of the Jedi did exist on paper, and then it got junked, it got recycle binned. And it turns out that never happened. It was just some discussions. It was a vision of the film that he wanted that ended up getting kiboshed before pen ever really touched paper in that regards. And then he never went on to work on Return of the Jedi anyway. And then he also sort of acknowledges very diplomatically that he was probably right to have been gotten fired from Empire Strikes Back, because he could not keep Kirshner under control, and he could not keep that train running on time. He just could not do it.
And Brian, let me ask you this. The version of Jedi that has been discussed, do you think it would have been a better Jedi or worse than what we got?
That's hard, because like I said, you're short on details.
Yeah.
With that Kurtz version. The Kurtz version is darker. Luke walking off into the sunset, and the Han Solo sort of dying. I've been a big proponent of the Han dying in Jedi, but it's always been in concert with the Kasdan version of events. I think if Kurtz were going to kill Han, it would have been in Carbonite. Harrison Ford would have never come back. And the way I had it in my head in the Kasdan version would be him sacrificing himself to detonate the shield generator manually.
Right.
Yeah, that would work really well.
It would add a lot of weight to the ending of Jedi, which I think when people complain about the yub nub ending of Jedi, it's sort of that sense of, oh, we just defeated the Empire way too easily, right? And there there was not enough casualty along the way. It doesn't feel right.
And so, yeah, I'm a proponent
Well, that
of
one Ewok died. That was pretty sad, Chris.
I'll
it's true.
be a proponent of Han, wishing Han had died in Jedi until I see him in Episode 7. But I don't think anything Kurtz did was outside the normal purview of a producer. And yeah, I mean, he got fired because he couldn't rein in Kershner. And he's had a lot of narrative over the years where he said he walked because he didn't like the direction Return of the Jedi was going in.
Well, yeah, and that's an interesting point. I mean, we have several other opportunities to see Han Solo die now.
Yeah, can't wait. No, but it's interesting though. If you read Rinsler's book about the making of Return of the Jedi, I mean, it doesn't feel like. I mean, Lucas had a bunch of ideas. There was some art going on, but there wasn't anything concrete. And it wasn't until Mark I came on, and it wasn't until Kasdan came on that it really started to solidify. And another interesting thing about that is that I think Kurtz gets mythologized as he didn't want to rein Kershner in because Kershner was making such a great movie. But when you look at how little money they had for Empire and how much Lucas of his own personal stake was putting on the line, I don't think he was thinking, I want to give Kershner everything I can for him to make the best movie possible. It was, he's spending my money and I need to make the movie I want to make.
Yeah.
You know, and people kind of have those starry-eyed.
The way that Kurtz is framing it in this clip that we just heard from Chris is more like he's spending George's money and I can't do anything about it because when I address him, he makes all the right sounds and says all the right things. And then when it's time to shoot, we have to stop for another 2 hours so we can drill more holes in the set and redo the squibs. You know, I mean, it's that sort of thing. And that was how the entire production went. I don't get the sense that he was like, well, I will throw myself on this sword because I know it means that the movie's going to be greater. It was more like, I have to eat all of these grenades. Thank God the movie was worth eating them. That's how.
And I think it's the fan reaction though where you get that, where the fan reaction was like, "Well, Kurtz is a hero. He was letting Kershner do what he wanted." But you hear Kurtz kind of saying like, "Yeah, I couldn't do a thing with that guy. Like,
I could not stop."
I do feel a little bit of sympathy for that because I mean, you know, his Kurtz. I mean, one thing he doesn't say here is what we read in the Rinsler books is that he was sort of on a knife edge to begin with at the beginning of Empire. That costs had overrun on Star Wars. George is dead set against costs overrunning anywhere in anything. He's very sort of fiscally conservative in that sense. And he, you know, what we get the sense of in the making of Empire Strikes Back is this notion that Kurtz almost had to plead for his job as producer on Empire. And talking to Howard Kazanjian, the producer on Return of the Jedi, I got the sense that, you know, I mean, Kazanjian basically says he was brought in as a potential substitute Kurtz right from day one on Empire. You know, that George was saying, you know, look, you got to get ready to step into this thing. I might need you at any second.
Well, it's not easy being a producer if you can't control who you're supposed to control.
It's tough because what he ended up with at the end of the day is brilliant. Yeah. And you got to be so frustrated being there on set watching this brilliant director doing this amazing thing, coming up with the perfect lighting and the beautiful colors of Empire.
It's funny, one of the bits of advice that Lucas gave to Kershner could be applied to the entire situation, and it should have been taken to heart by everybody. But Lucas told Kershner at the outset, like, don't expect anything to work.
Yeah, that was part of Kurtz's downfall as well, because they decide to shoot in the wintry climes, and like the worst winter ever hits them. Mark Hamill injures himself. Kershner, this is the first big budget film he's really worked on ever, and it's not like he really knows how those particular battleships are supposed to sail. He doesn't have any real experience with it, just like George didn't when he sat down to make his space epic. Like, he was coming off of a really quiet, weird satire on consumerism, and then he makes like an homage to riding around in hot rods and throwing water balloons at people. And then he goes and he makes a space epic. He doesn't really know what he's doing, and it gave him 15 different tumors, and he started cutting hair off of his head, right? And then Kirchner is going to follow up the most well-known movie of all time at that point. It's his first big budget film, and Kurtz has to try and ride herd over that while the rest of the world is crumbling down on his shoulders.
Man,
and the guy
must
who
be
put him
difficult.
in that position already doesn't trust him. Like, that's a tough situation to have to be in.
And the other thing he couldn't control at all was the election of Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah.
Which happened during the production of Empire Strikes Back, and immediately the markets gave that a vote of confidence. The pound sterling starts shooting up against the dollar, and they're looking at, I think it was about $500,000 more in costs immediately because of that. And that's the kind of stuff you can't control.
One more reason to hate Margaret Thatcher.
Is there anything Margaret Thatcher did not ruin? My God. Oh, and by the way, while we're on the subject, congratulations, Chris, on keeping Scotland.
Oh, thank you. That was a close run thing, I have to say. I was a little concerned about that one.
You guys would have lost so much flavor over there, and it's not like you guys have flavor in the UK, so it's a good thing.
Exactly.
Scotland.
There was one thing I wanted to talk about with you guys, if we have time, Mike.
Yeah, let's. We can do it.
And it's not book related, but if you want more tidbits like this from everyone involved in Star Wars, get Chris's book, because Chris, you dove in and you did the hard work to try to cut through all of the mythology. And I think it's important, especially before everyone is gone.
There isn't a lot of time left to do so. So it was an exhausting work that Chris had to do. He did an amazing job on it. If you're going to pick up the book, make sure you go cover to cover with it, and then leave reviews about it anywhere you can, because it's, even if you just like to read words, it's a good book.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Labor of love.
I like. Mike, were you trying to get blurbed there on the back cover? Even if you like to read words, read this book.
I mean, if you want to add that, by all means, go ahead. But
Mike has the absolute distinction of being the first guy to review the book on Amazon, which I didn't even know Amazon was accepting reviews yet, because it isn't actually out till September 30th. But people have been getting early copies, and Mike has the first review. So thank you, Mike.
Wait a minute, so is one of the pull quotes on that review, if you like words, you will like this?
Absolutely. If you like to read words, read this book.
So the thing I wanted to ask you guys about really fast is if you saw the reports of that interview between Rian Johnson and Terry Gilliam.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the idea that Terry Gilliam asked him, like, are you going to bring back Frank Oz and Yoda and the puppet and everything? And Rian Johnson was like, how could you not?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't there the rest of the world would answer that the same way, right?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like something you say to Terry Gilliam simply because Terry Gilliam can be a scary man, and you don't want to invoke that man's wrath, even if it's a very friendly podcast interview. But I don't get the sense that Frank Oz necessarily wants to puppeteer that thing ever again. Reading interviews with Frank Oz, it seems like if you asked him and you paid him, that yes, he would probably go ahead and do it, but it doesn't seem to make any sense to him anymore that you would do it. Like, just cook him up in a computer, you make him look really good. I'll come in and I'll give myself, a bunch of throat scratchies by doing the voice for 2 hours, and then I'll go home and spend my check. It seems like what Rian Johnson and Terry Gilliam were really saying back and forth there is, do you like to try and blend the old ways of making movies with all the new technology that we have? And Rian Johnson was like, hell yes, I do. Because that seems to end up turning out the best looking movies, period. It's never a case of all CGI is good or all practical is better, death to CGI. It's always more of, how can a director best use the tools that he is given to bring together a sort of cohesive visual aesthetic that ends up working to the good of your storytelling. And J.J. Abrams is very good at it. I honestly don't think that this Star Wars Episode 7 is going to look any different appreciably than what he's already done with both Star Trek movies and Super 8. Yeah. And that alone is going to make this probably the prettiest Star Wars movie that's ever been made. Much respect to Peter Shushitsky, who did make the prettiest Star Wars movie ever made, Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back. But I mean...
But it's a very diplomatic answer, though. Even if they go one way or the other, I mean, it's the diplomatic answer, not to irritate or get people angry.
Yeah, but I mean, even if all J.J. Abrams does is make a movie as pretty as Star Trek from 2009, it's probably going to be the best looking Star Wars movie that's ever been made.
Yeah.
And we already have a sense of at least one object in it, because of course the other big thing that came out this week was the video of the Millennium Falcon.
Yeah.
As it will be, and the hidden Batmobile.
I love that was like secondary. Like the video hits, and all anyone can talk about is this slow, loving, caressing pan across the set of the Millennium Falcon, this giant prop that you can walk around in
to a
with
roller
sports
skate
theme playing underneath it, and nobody cares that Batman shows up. Nobody talks about the fact that there's a Batman glued to the bottom of the Millennium Falcon. All they want to talk about is the fact that they have goose pimples giving birth to goose pimples live on their arm as they're watching the first part of that video.
You gotta admit, it was pretty fun to watch.
Because we've never seen the Falcon shot like that before. Think of all the times you've seen the Millennium Falcon in the Star Wars movies, and it's usually parked, or maybe it's just a matte painting in and of itself, or it's, zigzagging through asteroids. It's moving too fast for us to really appreciate all the work that went into that particular prop. And this is the first time that someone has dragged a camera in slow motion over the side of this beautiful ship, and you've got that evocative John Williams music playing underneath it. Absolutely, it's going to take someone who's been a Star Wars fan for 10, 20, 30 years, and it's going to turn them into a puddle of love and nostalgia all at the same time. It's great.
Go ahead, Brian.
I just hope it's not a portent of the future and that Zack Snyder's going to get his hands on Star Wars. I
think it is.
I know you do, but that doesn't mean I can hope that it's not.
He is certainly auditioning the hardest for the role out of any director living today.
What's interesting, though?
We talked about this on the previous podcast.
Yeah.
Zack Snyder was the very first director that Lucasfilm ever talked to, period. And I think it was for one of these spin-off things. And I think part of the reason you have this Twitter back and forth in the first place is because it's one Star Wars director, current, teasing another Star Wars director, future, about their own little projects that are going on currently. I think it's one of those, like, all in the family, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, gonna elbow you in the ribs. You're coming up next, champ. Haha. I'm gonna set a pretty high bar for you to have to clear. Like, I really think Zack Snyder is gonna end up working Star Wars movie by around 2017, 2018.
All right, Brian wants to talk. Go ahead, Brian.
I'm curious to wonder why you guys think StarWars.com or Star Wars or Lucasfilm or Disney, no one has officially, like, the closest thing we've had to an official acknowledgement that Rian Johnson is directing 8 and 9 is the details on a YouTube video on the Star Wars website.
Yeah, why haven't they released? I think it's because they just want to, like, if anything official about future Star Wars movies is going to come out, it's either going to be a press release to the to the industry rags, or it's going to be something about Episode 7. I think they really want to maintain a clean focus, as clean a focus as possible on whatever Episode 7 is going to be.
I agree with Bobby on that.
Yeah, I think anything that sort of distracts from that, as far as marketing goes, is something they don't want to dabble in. So obviously, Rian Johnson is writing and is going to direct Episode 8. And they don't seem to be concerned about him openly talking about it. They're not looking to smack anybody down for it. But if something's going to come out of Lucasfilm or Star Wars officially, it's going to be aimed at drawing your eye towards Episode 7 as much as possible. I think that's all it is.
That video shows the difference between, a brilliant director of photography and cameraman and people who do this for a living and are very good at what they do, as compared to me, who got out my Millennium Falcon and my GoPro camera on a little skateboard today and tried to do the same video. It does not look as good. Even putting the music over it, it does not look as great. So I was much more inspired by the first video that I saw.
What it also shows is that that Episode 7 is going to be the most Easter egg filled movie, I think, in history. I think we're going to spend the next 40 years decoding every single Easter egg in Episode 7. So this is sort of a tradition that kind of started with the prequels, the little Easter eggs of, the Millennium Falcon was in Revenge of the Sith, and we saw E.T. in the Galactic Senate.
Yeah.
But it goes back and forth with Star Trek, too. The Millennium Falcon was in...
So was R2.
First Contact, and R2 was in both of Abrams' Star Trek movies.
I don't know, guys. I look forward to speaking about it with you for 40 years to come. How's that sound? All right, so is that everything we're going to discuss tonight then on this episode of Full of Sith?
We have the contest.
Oh, yes, we do. Chris's publisher was kind enough to send us a few extra copies of the book in to give out to the listeners. Not to give out, but we're going to do a little contest. And Chris came up with some great questions. There's the first two people to answer these two questions combined. I want them to both answer both. Didn't that make it a little harder, Chris?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to make it for a show like this, which has very specialized Star Wars listeners. I didn't want to do, what does TIE Fighter stand for? I wanted to do something a little
Twin
more.
Ion
Engines. Yeah.
Exactly. See, it just comes out. Exactly. It's the sound of a slowed down elephant. Everyone knows that. So shall I
Yes, you ask them. You have the honor. It was your book, sir.
Relatively hard questions here. Okay, question number 1. Name the cartoon that was shown before the 70mm screenings of the original Star Wars in 1977. The full name of that cartoon. All right. And then the second question is, name the movie that came out around about the same time as Star Wars and actually beat it for its total gross in the first week that Star Wars was out. So in the first week Star Wars was out, what movie was top of the box office?
And to say this, as it being a hard question, Brian got one of these right.
I will tell you, though, that question I got wrong, it's never been in my head before. That bit of knowledge has never been rattling around in my head, and I will never forget it again.
It will never leave going forward.
Never.
All right, so if you want to send that in, the first two people that answer both questions properly will win How Star Wars Conquered the Universe by Chris Taylor. We will get it in and send it along to you. If you want to email us those answers, do so at holocron@fullofsith.com. And please, Chris, tell everybody where they can find you online.
Well, you can find me at Mashable, where I'm the deputy editor. And you can also find me on Twitter at FutureBoy. It's my handle. And, of course, most importantly of all, the website for the book, HowStarWarsConquered.com. And you can find out all the ordering information there, presuming that you don't want to go get it on Amazon. There are many other options that we provide on the site.
That's excellent. So if you want to leave a voicemail, please do so, 206-426-5592, or you can use the SpeakPipe app on our website, which is fullofsith.com. There you can find our contact information, like our Twitters, at fullofsith, at the mic, at swankmotron, at Bobby Roberts PDX. Also, we're really getting close to, or if we haven't beaten it already, 20,000 likes on Facebook. If you haven't done that already, go to facebook.com/fullofsith and like us there. Also, lots of great iTunes reviews that have come in. So if you haven't left a review for the show yet, please do so at iTunes or on Stitcher. I was going through the stats the other day on Stitcher, guys, and I'm very pleased on the rankings and the amount of playlists that we are in on Stitcher. So I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. You three guys, lots of fun. Chris, Brian, Bobby. I'll give all the rest of the links on the website because I think I'm ready to be done now. So for episode 83 of Full of Sith, for Brian Young, Bobby Roberts, and Chris Taylor, I am the Mike Pilot. May the Force be with you always.
Sir, if you'll not be meeting me, I'll close down for a while.
This is Plo Kool. The Force will be with you. Always. 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 always, 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 always.